Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about pollinators. It's kind of an exciting topic, so we're going to get right to it. And what we're actually going to talk about today are the common characteristics of bees that distinguish them from flies and wasps. We're going to talk a little bit about the life cycles of social and solitary bees, and we're also going to talk about the identification characteristics of common native bees. We know that the order of bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies is called Hymenoptera, or if you don't, you just found that out. The key characteristics of all Hymenoptera are two pairs of membranous wings that are connected by tiny little hooks, which are really hard to see if the bee or wasp has them folded on top of one another. So if they're resting on like a flower, it's going to be hard to tell whether they have two pairs of wings or one pair of wings. And you're probably looking up there and you're saying bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. Well, ants don't have wings, but actually ants do have wings in their reproductive stage. So that is why they're also part of the order Hymenoptera. Hymenoptera has a complete metamorphosis. So they go from egg to larva to pupa to adult. So that's one of the characteristics of them. Also, females are able to determine the sex of their offspring by either laying a fertilized egg, which becomes a female, or an unfertilized egg, which becomes a male. Another easy identification is they have skinny waists. So you're talking a skinny attachment between their abdomen and their thorax. So they have this slight constriction. Or another way to look at it is that both the thorax and the abdomen have an oval shape. So if you're looking at that and you see an oval shape, it's probably somebody in our Hymenoptera order. Also, female Hymenoptera have an ovipositor to deposit eggs in particular locations. So say they're going to put it in the bark. They're probably going to have a longer ovipositor to be able to get their eggs inside bark crevices. Whereas if they're just using the cracks inside of wood that's, just right on the top, they may have a very short ovipositor. Some of the Hymenoptera have actually modified their ovipositors so that they're stingers, and they can deliver venom from that as well. And you can think of bees, stinging wasps, and ants. Those have the ability to not just sting, but some of them have the ability to introduce venom as they sting. Think yellow jacket, paper wasps, hornets, mason wasps, some ants, mining bees, carpenter, bumblebees, honeybees. All of these have that function, a stinger rather than a functional ovipositor. So you're saying to yourself, well, if they've modified the ovipositor, so how do they lay their eggs? Well, that's simple. They have a area right beneath where the ovipositor is that their eggs come out of. So while they've modified something to become a stinger, they still have that ability to lay eggs. When you're looking at bees, ants, and stinging wasps, they typically have a thread-like antenna. That's not to say that everybody in the Hymenoptera group all have long thread-like antenna, but most of them do. But there are a few exceptions, as there's always exceptions in everything, that have either feather-like ones or club-like ones, and we'll talk more about them later. Also, something about the Hymenoptera is they have a social behavior. So some ants, our European honeybee and bumblebees are ones that come to mind, that they're social. They come together as colonies. They're not solitary, just coming together to mate only. Also, they have honey production, which is extremely rare. Most people think European honeybee when they think honey production, and that's true. But also, bumblebees produce honey. They produce it in much smaller quantities because they don't need to store food like the honeybees do. So let's talk a little bit about the basic bee anatomy. We were just talking about how, they have skinny little waists where the thorax and the abdomen meet. So in case you didn't know where the thorax and the abdomen was, here's a wonderful picture. You see where the head is, and right below the head is the thorax. And then you can see what we were talking about, how it pinches really together where that thorax and that abdomen meet. They have the long antenna that we were talking about, They have their eyes, foreleg, middle leg, hind leg, so they have a total of 6 legs or 3 pairs. And they have a total of 4 wings. And this is a good picture because it's showing how when they are resting their wings, it's very hard to tell that they actually have 4 wings in total. It just looks like 1 pair of wings. So don't always look at that. If you're looking at something on the fly, so to speak, you won't be able to tell sometimes whether it's really 2 or 4 pairs of wings unless you have a specimen at hand. So let's look at bees first and their distinguishing characteristics. The first thing you're going to notice is that long tongue. And compared to other insects, it is a long tongue. And that's because they go in and they get nectar. And they need that type of a modification to their tongue to do that. Some bees do have shorter tongues, but they're still much longer than flies and wasps. As we said, they have 2 pairs of wings. And bees are, for the most part, hairy compared to wasps and ants. Their hairs are branched. So look up there at that expanded view, and it almost looks like little Christmas trees poking out. Those are branched hairs, and they're branched so that they're capable of holding pollen. They capture it sometimes, and they hold it. So those are things that your bees are going to have. The hairs themselves are called scopa. And this is somewhere that the pollen is packed, but honeybees themselves have little baskets, carrying baskets on the back of their legs that they pack pollen with moistened with a little nectar, and then you'll see big, huge amounts as they're flying along, going from flower to flower. So, in identifying male and female bees, what's the difference? Well, we often talk about bees or the males being smaller than the females, but if you don't have a male and a female on the same flower, or you don't have 2 specimens, that's pretty hard to tell the difference between, a little bit of a 1/4 inch difference when you're looking at a flower with different bees on it. But compared to humans, they're the opposite. The females are larger than the males. Males have longer, more slender antenna, and if you have a hand lens, you can find males have 13 segments and females only have 12 segments. So that is one very specific way of identifying male and female bees. Males do not have that ovipositor. Only the females do. So the males cannot sting, and they can't lay eggs, obviously, so they've never had that structure. And males are like human males, and they have facial hair, believe it or not. These additional hairs are between their eyes and above the mandibles, and you can almost think of them as like a mustache. So that's a couple ways of telling the difference between male and female bees. Now, if we're talking about the difference between bees versus flies, it's a little bit different. We want to realize that flies only have 1 pair of wings, okay, not 2 pair. And again, unless you've got a specimen, it's going to be hard to determine if there's 1 or 2. But flies have really short, stout antennae, and that's probably the easiest way to determine if it's a bee or a fly. If you look up there at that picture, there's a tiny little antenna that are sticking out. Flies also they're more robust between the thorax and the abdomen compared to the pinched waist of a bee. And look at the eyes. The large eyes, they meet at the top of the head in a fly, whereas with a bee, there's a little bit of a distance between the eyes themselves. And flies typically are not hairy, or if they have any hair, it's very sparse. And they don't have any pollen-carrying structures, so that's another way. And their tongues are short, and they actually aren't really like a tongue. They're like a sponge at the end that they lap up their food with. So these are all ways that you can tell the difference between a bee and a fly. Now, if you're doing an identification between bees and wasps, again, they have no pollen-carrying structure, but they do have a pinched waist, but they're not hairy. And the hairs that they have are not branched. So if you have a hand lens again, or some type of magnification, you can kind of quickly see whether the hairs are branched or not. And wasps have spines on their legs, okay? And they're visible even just from the naked eye. So they share a thread waist and the same type of elbowed antenna, but there's other ways. And remember, too, that wasps are carnivores compared to the pollen-seeking bees that are vegetarian. So if you see something flying by and it has a bee in its, or a fly, another bee or a fly or something else in its grass, it's probably a wasp because they are carnivores. And the difference between flies and wasps is that spines on the legs. And wasps are really generally not hairy at all. So let's start with our first quiz here. Is this a bee or isn't it a bee? And the first thing we need to look at is, does it have hairs? Well, this one appears to have a hairy body. Does it have a long tongue or a short tongue? Well, I'm looking at that tongue, and that's a pretty long tongue. Does it have a skinny waist or does it have no waist? Well, it's a little bit hard to tell in this, but it definitely looks like there's a pinching going on between the thorax and the abdomen. And the eyes, do they meet completely at the top, or is there a space between them? Look at this nice long segmented antenna. What do we think here? Bee or not a bee? It's a bee. Very good. And if you didn't get that, you're going to want to go over some of the things we just talked about again. So, again, a bee or not a bee? Well, let's look again. Look at those neat antennae, first of all. They look like little feathery clubs almost. I see more like a sponge apparatus sticking out and not a tongue. I do see hair. It's got some hair. I can't tell with the wings. It has, 3 pairs of legs. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at a bee or are we not looking at a bee? It's not a bee. So let's continue on. A bee or not a bee? What do we see here? We see it's got a lot of hair. And it looks extremely hairy. The legs, even without a hand lens here, it makes me immediately wonder, are those branching hairs that I'm seeing there? I look at the eyes. Are they meeting at the top of the head like a fly or not? Look at those long antennae. What do we think about the long antenna? So is this a bee or is this not a bee? It's a bee. So now let's talk a little bit about native diversity. And in this picture, you're probably wondering, what is that? Well, what it is, it's the biggest species and the smallest species of bees in North America. We've got the tiny little Perdita minima, which is a mining bee, and then we've got a large carpenter bee. So these are the differences between sizes of bees. Keep in mind there's 4,000 species of bees native to North America alone, and they occur in a wide range of sizes, shapes, and colors. That little Perdita minima is less than 2 millimeters long. It's a solitary bee, and you can actually find it in like sandy desert soils is where you can find it, whereas bumblebees and carpenter bees are the largest native bees in the United States. And there's numerous different ecosystems that they actually occur in, all the way from tropical to subtropical to temperate. And in the United States, they can be found all the way from the south, from Florida, Arizona, all the way up into where we're at, obviously. So there's a lot of native bees that we have. So it's not always just, when we think bees, we shouldn't always think just honeybee. There's a lot of native bees as well. But speaking of honeybees, let's talk a little bit about these non-native bees and some of their characteristics. Honeybees have a caste system with a single queen with a bunch of female workers, and she produces a few male drones to mate with the queen, and that's about it. It's mostly females. A colony will consist of as many as 50,000 workers. So that means a queen lays about 1,000 or more eggs per day. That's a lot of eggs. Honeybee workers, so the female workers, they travel 3 or more miles from their hive to collect pollen and nectar to bring back to the colony. And when we think of honeybees, we always think of, honey and wax, but actually the biggest economical thing that honeybees do for humans is they pollinate our crops and our flowers. So that is more important than the honey production that they do. So we have to keep that in mind. They may not mean to pollinate our plants, but it is an offshoot of what they do. It's a non-native bee, so it's the western honeybee, which is also known as the European honeybee. And it's native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, and it occurs now across the globe because it's been brought into all the places because everybody wants to have honey. So the characteristics of our honeybees are the pollen basket. It's a concave section on the hind leg, and it's surrounded by those stiff hairs, branched hairs that we talked about. And what they do is they collect that pollen, and they comb the pollen grains off, and they add a little bit of nectar to wet it, and then they just pack it until they're finally full, and then they go back to the hive. Remember that honeybees are social, and they are really what we call a perennial colony. The queen and some of the workers survive the winter, unlike the bumblebee colonies where only the queen survives. So during winter, if you're raising honeybees, you have to be sure to leave enough honey stores so that they can survive the winter and create enough heat to stay alive. There's 3 broad groups of native bees, okay? Of our native bees, we can call them ground nesting, cavity nesting, or sometimes called wood or tunnel nesting, and our bumblebees. So our bumblebees are our social groups, okay? So we need to understand that there's a lot of native bees that we can actually encourage in our gardens and in our areas just by kind of understanding a little bit about them and what they require to survive in our area. When we talk about bumblebees, remember I just said they're social, but they're ground nesting, and they often use cavities or old rodent nests for their colonies. And in North America, there's 50 different species of them. And they have that very characteristic black and yellow look. They're large. They almost seem a little clumsy when they're flying, if they're flying back and forth. They have the pollen baskets on their legs that you can see in the pictures. So those are all things that bumblebees, characteristics of them. So in the life cycle of a bumblebee colony, we have to remember that unlike honeybees, which we call perennial colonies, bumblebees are annual colonies. They start each spring by a solitary queen. And it's very similar to thinking about a perennial plant or an annual one. In this diagram, you can see the queen there hibernating in the wintertime. And in the spring, she kind of wakes up and she emerges and she searches for a suitable nest site. And she typically picks, like we said, an abandoned rodent nest or some small cavity in the soil that's already created for her. And in that space, she brings in moss and hair, or grass, and there's only a single entrance. There's no entrance in and another exit out for safety. It's in and out the same entrance. Once she's constructed a suitable home, she begins to prepare for some offspring. So in the spring, the queen goes out and she builds what we call a waxy honey pot. And she puts in there nectar and pollen. And after she collects that pollen, she forms it into a mound on the floor of her nest. And then she lays eggs in the pollen, and she coats it with wax secreted from her body. And just like a mother bird, the queen uses the warmth of her body to incubate her eggs. And she sits on the pollen mound, raising her body temperature to between 98 and 102, and that's Fahrenheit. And for nourishment, she consumes that honey pot she made. And she keeps that like right within her reach so she never has to even leave the eggs. And in just 4 days, those eggs hatch. And then she continues her maternal care for those that have just hatched. She goes out and she forages for pollen and she feeds her offspring, and then they pupate. And only when that first brood emerges as bumblebee adults can she quit the daily tasks of foraging and housekeeping, and the workers take over. And they not just forage, they now begin the nest construction. And when the queen stays inside, they bring her food, they help her with where she's laying her eggs. And so she can concentrate completely on just laying eggs. And they actually help her incubate her eggs. And quickly that colony swells in numbers. But at the end of the summer, she begins laying unfertilized eggs, which become males. And the bumblebee queen then also lays some female fertilized eggs to become new fertile queens for the following year. And these new queens are really the genetic line that is going to continue when she dies. And she will die that year. And her work will then be complete. So as winter approaches, those new queens and the males mate. And the males die pretty soon after mating. And then the new generation of bumblebee queen, she seeks shelter for the winter, and the whole process starts all over again. We have to remember that bumblebees make excellent pollinators because they're active early in the spring, and they'll begin visiting flowers when it's even cold outside, where your honeybees may come out to defecate, but they're going to go back in and they're going to be a little bit like, ooh, it's a little bit cold out there. I think I'm going to wait a few more days. But our native honeybees, or bumblebees, excuse me, are saying, hey, this is wonderful. You know, I can be out in this weather. It's not a big deal. So they're out much quicker than the honeybees are out. And they will even fly and pollinate in cool, wet weather conditions when most honeybees are home watching TV, you know? Because of their large size, honeybees are actually more efficient than bumblebees. I keep saying that backwards. Sorry about that. Bumblebees are more efficient than honeybees at pollinating things like blueberries, cranberries, melons, even tomatoes, because they do a behavior that's called buzz pollination. The scientific word is sonication, where the bees grab the pollen-producing structure of the flower in their jaws and they vibrate their wing musculature. And this vibration causes that pollen to dislodge that would otherwise remain trapped in the flower's anthers. And some plants, peppers, and some of the things I just mentioned, and tomatoes, require buzz pollination for the plant to actually release its pollen. So the American and the common eastern bumblebee, they're both reared commercially, and they're important pollinators of tomatoes in greenhouses and blueberries. And research has shown a positive correlation between the density of these bumblebees and how much blueberry fruit set there is. So they're extremely important for our commercial producers. So what am I here? If you're looking at, do the eyes come together? Are there a long antenna? Is it a club antenna? How many legs do we see? The wings, again, are hard to tell if it's one set or two, but we see a nice waist there. We see hair. What do we think that we are? Look at the legs with the yellow on the back, rear legs. It should tell us what? That we're a honeybee. Absolutely. Let's talk about the life cycle of these solitary bees. We've talked a lot about our social bees, but what about our solitary bees? Solitary bees usually live for a year, although we only see the adult stage, and because we don't see what's happening below ground. These insects spend much of their lives hidden in a nest, going through egg, larval, and pupal stages, so we can't see that happening. When the males emerge from their nest, they usually hang around other nest openings or around flowers to find a mate. And after that female emerges, she mates. She spends her time creating a nest, finding provisions for her young. She'll make a nest, and with each brood cell, and where she lays just one egg per cell, she will provision the cell with pollen and nectar, and then she lays that egg in that pollen ball. And after weeks of preparing and provisioning 2 or more dozen brood cells, she dies. The eggs hatch, the larvae eat the pollen, they grow through those instars. But once the pollen ball is consumed, the larva pupates, and most species spend the winter as pupa, and then they emerge in spring as adults. Now, the large carpenter bee, it is a large bee, and it's somewhat hairless, and it has a shiny abdomen. it's those features that really distinguish the carpenter bee from the bumblebee because they both have that yellow-black look. Large carpenter bee males can be territorial, and those are the ones that give you a little bit of a scare because they'll come buzz right at your face. But you have to remember that male bees don't have the ability to sting because they have no ovipositor. But due to their large size, they need open-faced flowers that will support their weight. So if you're trying to encourage these bees, you need to make sure you have some flowers that are rather large. Some species will put their strong jaws to work and they chew into the side of flowers such as blueberries. And the problem with that is they bypass the pollen, and it's known as robbing the flower. And when they do that, they pull out the nectar, and the pollen never gets taken from one to the next. They also make nests in wood and can be very destructive when they nest in like exposed structural wood of your porches or your decks, or even sometimes they'll go into your wooden patio furniture. Now the small carpenter bee has a distinctive shape. It appears more cylindrical with a blunt end, but most have a yellow or white markings on their face, and most species visit a wide variety of flowers. So those are some characteristics between the large and the small. The two key characteristics of longhorned bees are the long antennae and the pale bands of hair on their abdomen. Little is known about some of these bees, and this is one of them. These bees, they are known to frequent sunflowers. Some species like asters and daisies, and the lower part of the male's face is frequently yellow. So these are all things to think about if you're looking for these bees to see if you have them. So there's a strong association with sunflowers in the habits of males. They seem to patrol sunflowers for mates during the day, and they'll either sleep in clusters on the flower heads at night. And they all make solitary nests in the ground. Now, our mining and plasterer bees, the key characteristics of them are they have hairy hind legs and thorax. And some species have extra hair on their face that sort of resembles a mustache. The females have facial depressions that look like eyebrows. Now, mining and plasterer bees are in the family of Colletes. And they get their name from a secretion they use to plaster the sides of their mud nests, which may be in the ground or it's in a crevice of stones or bricks. And this secretion is actually waterproof, which allows them to nest in areas like stream banks. And the secretion is it's from a special gland and spread with their two-lobed tongues, which is not easy to see in the field. You wouldn't probably be able to see the tongue unless you had a specimen. Colettes are a widespread and common genus with over, 100 species in North America, all the way from, northward to the Arctic Circle. And viewed from the front, their face appears heart-shaped, and they can carry pollen on the upper part of their hind legs and thorax. So they also visit some are specialists, and they visit a small range of plant species. So you need to know if you're trying to encourage them, you need to know what those plant species are to get them to come in. They tend to nest in lawns, but they don't pose any threat to humans. They have weak stingers. They can't penetrate human skin. So don't be afraid of them if you're seeing them, nesting in an area that might be disturbed and the soil's exposed. Most of them are black or dull metallic blue or green, and they have moderately hairy with bands of pale hair on their abdomen. And they can carry pollen on the upper part of their hind legs. It almost seems like it's in their armpits. And they visit a wide variety of flowers and nest on the ground, some of them. They typically like sandy areas, or they might also be found near shrubs or undershrubs. I've actually found some of these in school situations where the children are running a lot in certain areas and they're disturbing the soil, and the soil doesn't grow grass in certain areas very well, and that's where you're going to find solitary bees. And again, these ones are not something to be worried about. So what bee is this? Take a look. We're seeing a hairy thorax, but a not so hairy abdomen. We can see the yellow coloring. We can see that the eyes don't quite meet at the top. We have long antennae. So looking at this, what bee would we think this is? That's right. That shiny abdomen is the giveaway. And even the yellow and black thorax helps you. So you have a carpenter bee. Now our green sweat bees, the key characteristic is that bright metallic green color. And these are closely related to others that we call sweat bees, but these bees are actually not attracted to sweat. Most have a bright metallic head and thorax and a black or maybe a yellow striped abdomen. However, some females are all metallic green throughout. The females are really actually fast-flying bees. They have short tongues and they have difficulty getting that nectar out of deep flowers. So if you want to encourage these green sweat bees, you really want to have flowers that don't require them to have to go deep into a flower. The nests are deep vertical burrows and sloping soils around banks. So again, where your grasses are a little bit more difficult to grow. Most species are solitary, but some can nest communally, where you can find up to 24 females that share a single nest entrance, but each one has its own cluster of brood cells. They don't share the brood cells. Some species will nest in rotting wood or even in pre-existing tunnels. So it's kind of neat that we consider them solitary, but in some instances they exhibit social behaviors. Now, the small dark bees. They're also known as sweat bees because they are attracted to perspiration for its salt content. They actually lap it up. So you can see these tiny bees, they'll land on your arms and you'll feel like a little tingle, and you can tell your children if that happens. Don't be alarmed, you just got kissed by a bee. Now there's 10 species in North America, so not very many, and this is in the, and I'm not going to say it right, Halictus species. And there's only 10, and they're dark with a band of pale hair on the outer edge of each abdominal section, and making them look, they almost look striped. And they visit a variety of flowers, and they're actually important pollinators of hybrid sunflowers and watermelons, believe it or not. They nest in flat ground with a sandy soil, so like a loose soil with low clay content and high silt. And they line their brood nests with wax-like material from an organ at the tip of their abdomen. So very interesting. Excuse me. The Lasioglossum variety has 400 species in North America and 1,700 worldwide. And they're dusky black with dull green or blue, and even sometimes a metallic with a band of pale hair along the base of each abdominal segment, making them appear striped as well. Excuse me. They visit a variety of flowers, they nest in the ground, and often in areas with loose sandy soils as well. And nests consist of a narrow shaft that branches a few times. Hopefully I don't cough anymore. Let me get this going again. Now, many gardeners will immediately recognize this leaf symptom seen on garden plants. It's not a disease. You see these circular discs removed from leaves. They indicate the work of the leafcutter bee. And this bee favors a nice soft textured leaf to line its nest. And the garden plants that it really loves include ash, rose, redbud, and anything that has a really nice softness to it. You barely ever notice the bee. All you really notice is after you go over to your plant and you see these nice little circles taking out from these leafcutter bees. And they also, like this right here, is a passion flower vine that it has taken stuff out of. Now, the key characteristics of the leafcutter bees, there's 1,100 species worldwide and 140 in North America. They cut pieces of leaves or petals even to line their nests or their brood cells. And they're actually like a smoky colored, they're stout bodied, and they have actually a flat abdomen, more flattened than we're used to on other ones. They have a broad head to accommodate really broad mandibles that they need to cut those leaves. And they often have an upturned abdomen, as you see in the photo in the bottom. They visit a wide range of flowers, but some species specialize on asters and the pea family. And they can nest in pre-existing cavities, whether that's artificial or natural, it doesn't matter. We'll even take things like abandoned beetle tunnels or hollow plant stems or gaps between bark or even hose pipes. So these are all places that they would use as housing. Now, key characteristics of the mason bee, which we hear a lot of lately, is that, well, first of all, they construct walls of mud to divide their nest cavities into brood cells. There's about 150 species in North America, and they also have a nice round, broad head. They don't really have any markings on their abdomen that you can kind of say, oh, look, it's yellow or it looks white or whatever. There's not really too many markings. And they're actually often mistaken for flies. And they commonly visit like flowering trees and shrubs in the rose family, especially fruit trees in orchards. So if you have a lot of roses or fruit trees, this is something that you might want to look for to see if you have them already. So think also apples, cherries, plums, any of those, they'll do that. They're actually tolerant of cold, wet weather. So again, they're native and they're good. They know this environment, this nice cold environment we live in. They're solitary nesters in beetle tunnels, dead wood, hollow stems, just like we talked about with the other people. It takes about 250 female orchard bees to effectively pollinate an acre of apples. And that's equivalent to the service of only 2 honeybee hives. So, but when you think about it, each honeybee hive has anywhere from 15 to 50,000 workers, whereas 250 is all it's required to do that. So encourage these bees. Okay, these bees are like the cuckoo birds, are kleptoparasites, meaning that they lay their eggs in other bees' nests and they have the host bee provision for their young. And these bees make up about 20% of all species of bees, believe it or not. Their presence indicates a healthy bee community. So there's about 80 species of these in the U.S. and Canada, and they actually resemble, if you're looking at them, small wasps. They don't forage for pollen, as they don't make their own nests, so they have no need to provision for young. And the adults do drink the nectar, so they can contribute to pollination, more by just feeding themselves. And primarily parasite bees in the Halictus, Aglaoptermon, the Lathoglossum, and the Nomia genera. So there are specific species that they do target. So what bee am I? Let's look at what we have here. We're looking at the eyes, and we don't see that they're meeting at the top, but we do see long antenna. What else do we see? We see some hair, but not a lot of hair. In this picture, it's hard to see how many legs they have, or even how many. Well, yes, I guess I can see three legs on one side, but I can't really tell the wings. It has a very unusual color, so maybe this would help us. So what bee am I? That's right, it's the mason bee. Now, our ground nesting solitary bees some of these ground nests can be over 3 feet deep. And many native bees are ground nesters, and making the conservation of sandy soil or bare ground important. So we need to make sure that maybe we should stop trying to make sure everything is covered with something and leave some areas that are without vegetation that we keep roughing up periodically at the beginning of each season to give them places to actually nest. So to encourage ground nesting bees, this is a good example of the type of soil that ground nesting bees are looking for to excavate their nests. And Actually, if you're looking at stuff, quite often these places are, as I said, in elementary schools where children are constantly running and knocking down vegetation. It's wet, it's muddy, so the vegetation has a hard time growing. But the bees love it because it gives them a little bit of an open area to actually nest in and make their newest things. And they're not really aggressive. So they're only active for a few weeks in the spring, and typically early enough so that the children aren't out very often. And then by the time they're done, the children are out and they've already done what they need to do to lay all their eggs. Sorry about that, trying not to cough again. About 30% of our native bees they nest as solitary individuals in like wooden tunnels, hollow stems, or abandoned beetle burrows, or boreholes found in trees or stumps. So again, to encourage them, don't be so quick to get rid of dead trees that we call snags, or to, brush up immediately piles and throw things away. Leave some natural looking things around that they can use to create their nests. When we want a perfect looking lawn, sometimes we're actually starving our native bee species in places for them to habitate. There's so many more things that the Xerces Society, who has pulled this program together, has information on, and you should really check it out. These are some resources that they have. And I hope that by the end of this, you realize that honeybees aren't the only thing that pollinates, and we have many native species here, and that we really should encourage all those native species so that if anything happens to one, that has another one that we can fall back on quickly. And here's more information. Any questions?